All right, baby, here we go. Chapter 9, Crisis. Section 1, Cycle and Crisis. Severe disruptions in the economic reproduction of a society are referred to as an economic crisis. In a capitalist economy, this means that a large number of the commodities produced are no longer sellable, not because there is no existing need for the corresponding products, but because there is no demand backed by buying power. Commodity capital can no longer be completely transformed into money capital, so that the advanced capital is poorly valorized and accumulation decreases. The demand on the part of capitalist enterprises for the elements of productive capital, means of production and labor power, also decreases. Mass unemployment and a decline in the consumption of the working class are the consequences, thus leading to further decline in demand that further intensifies the crisis. Capitalism is not the only mode of production in which massive poverty exists alongside enormous wealth, but it is the only mode of production where a surplus of goods constitutes a problem. Unsellable goods lead to the ruin of their owner, while people who need these goods the most are unable to sell the only thing they possess, their labor power. The reason is that capital has no need for their labor power, since it cannot profitably make use of that labor power. Ever since the early 19th century, when industrial capitalism became dominant in England and then in France and Germany and the United States, crises occurred in the developed capitalist societies at roughly 10-year intervals. Periods of accelerated accumulation with high rates of profit and increasing wages were followed by stagnation and crisis, which ultimately culminated in an initially slow and then accelerated recovery of accumulation. In the 20th century, this cyclical development continued, but the cycles were increasingly less pronounced than before. The importance of super-cyclical developments increased. With the global economic crisis of 1929, a long period of economic depression set in that was only surmounted in the 1950s, and in North America and Western Europe gave way to the long boom of the 1950s and 1960s, which rested on, quote, Fordism. This Wirtschaftswunder, which I think means economic miracle in German, this Wirtschaftswunder capitalism brought not only high profit rates, but also full employment and an extension of the welfare state in the leading capitalist countries. In this phase, there were also still cycles, but without acute crises. The capitalism known to Marx, which is characterized by crises, unemployment, and impoverishment, seemed to have been transcended, at least in the capitalist metropolises. But this state of affairs changed fundamentally with the global economic crisis of 1974 to 1975. The Fordist model of accumulation, with its cheap methods of increasing productivity, Taylorism, and mass production, had reached its limits. Profit rates declined, and cyclical movements increased in strength, although even in periods of recovery, growth rates were modest and unemployment remained high. Profit rates recovered in the 1980s and 1990s primarily as a result of stagnating or declining real wages, as well as comprehensive tax cuts for businesses and wealthy individuals that were financed primarily by cuts in social expenditures. There can be no doubt that the course of capitalist development in the last 180 years was de facto marked by crisis. However, the answer to the question as to the causes of these crises is subject to debate. The majority of classical political economists, as well as contemporary exponents of neoclassical economics, would dispute that crises are a result of the fundamental mechanics of capitalism. For classical and neoclassical economists, crises are caused by external influences, for example, state economic policies, but the capitalist market economy per se is free of crisis. Only John Maynard Keynes attributed recurrent mass unemployment to causes intrinsic to capitalism, thus laying the cornerstone for Keynesianism. In contrast, Marx attempted to prove that crises result from the capitalist mode of production itself, and that a crisis-free capitalism is impossible. However, one cannot find a comprehensive theory of crisis in Marx's work, but rather scattered, more or less elaborated observations that have been worked up by Marxists into quite distinct theories of crisis. With the analysis of money as a means of circulation, Marx had detected in the mediation of exchange in the mediation of exchange by money the general possibility of crisis. One can sell one's own commodity without necessarily buying another commodity with the money that was earned. By holding on to the money, the process of reproduction is interrupted. Say's law, which claims that there is a necessary equilibrium between buying and selling, or that supply necessarily includes an equal demand, is only valid when the circulation of commodities mediated by money is equated with direct barter. Only then does each sale coincide with the simultaneous purchase. Thus, when classical and neoclassical economics purport to substantiate the claim of an inherently crisis-free capitalism, they basically assume a capitalism without money. It must be explained how an actual crisis results from the mere possibility of crisis, why the chain of reproduction is interrupted. Of the various Marxist approaches to this question, considerations based upon the law of the tendential fall in the rate of profit played an important role in traditional Marxism. As a result of the falling rate of profit, the profit mass will also eventually fall, so that accumulation increasingly slows down and ultimately leads to crisis. This apparently close tie between the crisis theory and the law of the tendential fall in the rate of profit was usually behind the vehement defense of this law. However, Marx's decisive argument concerning the theory of crisis are completely independent of this law. In the first volume of Capital, Marx had already identified the production of relative surplus value as the fundamental tendency of capitalist development, decreasing the value of labor power by increasing the productivity of labor. The most important method for developing the productivity of labor is the introduction of increasingly improved machinery. The cost-saving introduction of machinery is mostly tied to the extension of the volume of production. An increase in productivity is therefore accompanied by an increase in the quantity of goods produced, which is further intensified by the necessities of competition. The need to be the first to flood the market with goods, the need to anticipate the devaluation of the means of production by attempting the fastest possible exhaustion of their productive capacity. The tendency for an unlimited extension of production confronts an ability to consume in society that is limited in variety of ways. Let me repeat that sentence. The tendency for an unlimited extension of production confronts an ability to consume in society that is limited in a variety of ways, which Marx makes clear in Volume 3 of Capital. The total social consumption is not limited to the individual consumption of end consumers. The total social consumption consists of the consumption of the working class, the luxury consumption of the capitalists, the investments, or more precisely, the replacement investments that replace used-up machinery, and the expansive investment through which additional means of production are acquired, that is, through which capital is accumulated. The consumption of the working class is constricted by the logic of capital valorization. Capitalists attempt to keep wages, as well as the number of employed laborers, as low as possible, since for an individual capitalist, the wage is merely an expense factor. Under consumptionists, theories of crisis are based upon this constricted power of consumption of the working class. As an explanation for the existence of crisis, the argument of excessively low wages and the resulting, quote, demand gap is insufficient. Wages are always kept lower than the total value of the product. This total value is equal to constant capital plus variable capital plus surplus value, where wages are only equal to variable capital. Wages, whether high or low, are never sufficient enough to constitute the demand for the total product. In addition to the consumption demand of the working class, there also exists the luxury demand of the capitalist, which is low relative to the total economy. However, so we can neglect it here. Finally, there is an investment demand. This is the decisive variable. The demand of capital for additional means of production depends upon it, as does indirectly the further development of the consumption of the working class, insofar as additional labor power is employed or not. Whether investment in productive capital, means of production and labor power, are high or low, depends on the one hand upon the expected profit. If only a small profit is expected, then investment is held back, and on the other hand, upon the difference between the expected rate of profit and the rate of interest. The individual capitalist, albeit not the capitalist class as a whole, always has the choice of investing his capital in productive capital or of employing it as an interest-bearing capital. Investment in fictitious capital increases relative to investment in productive capital when interest rates are high or when expectations of a rise in share prices increase. So capitalist production and capitalist consumption are not just differently determined. Rather, their determining factors are also downright antagonistic. A potentially unlimited production confronts a limited consumption, limited not in terms of human needs and desires, but by the logic of valorization. The consequence is a tendency towards the overproduction of commodities, overproduction relative to buying power, and the overaccumulation of capital, accumulated capital that either cannot be valorized at all or only very poorly, which ultimately leads to crisis. Reproduction stagnates, invested capital is devalued or even completely wiped out. The least profitable production facilities are closed down. The least profitable individual capitals go bankrupt. Workers are laid off and wages decline with the rise in unemployment. Crises are also enormous processes of destruction. Social wealth is annihilated and the living conditions of a large number of people worsen considerably. However, it is precisely these destructive moments that violently eliminate the imbalance between production and social consumption. Crises do not only have a destructive side. For the capitalist system as a whole, crises are quite productive. The destruction of unprofitable capitals reduces production, and the devaluation of functioning capital and low wages increase the rate of profit for the remaining capitals. Ultimately, interest rates once again decline, since the demand for borrowed capital also decreases. All of these factors combined clear the way for a renewed upturn, which is often supported by the introduction of technological improvements. An increased demand for new machinery stimulates investment in the means of production department. The department selling means of production, producing means of production. And as a consequence of rising unemployment, also accelerates accumulation in the means of consumption department. A new upturn begins that ultimately culminates in the next crisis. So crises are not just destructive. Rather, in crisis, the unity between spheres, such as production and consumption, that belong together but become independent of one another, production and consumption follow different determinations, is violently restored. Marx makes constant reference to the fact that crises perform a valuable service for the capitalist system precisely by means of these acts of destruction. Even if it is possible to figure out the mechanisms of crises in general, crises themselves cannot simply be prevented. For one thing, the pressure of competition forces individual capitalists to engage in specific behaviors, even if they know that this behavior has altogether destructive effects. But no individual can simply opt out, and the sole hope consists in emerging relatively unscathed. For another thing, the specific period of the cycle of crisis in which one finds oneself can never be determined with certainty. Is the economy still in a period of upturn, and will this continue, so that an extension of production is still worthwhile? Or has the state of overproduction already been reached, and will it make itself felt in a sales slump? It is precisely the constant development of the forces of production through the introduction of new methods of production, forced upon every producer who wishes to assert his or her presence on the market, that leads to shifts in demand flows. New branches emerge. Old branches disappear or lose their importance. Machines and raw materials that were previously important are no longer so. Old enterprises are devalued. New enterprises emerge without certainty as to whether they will yield profits at the expected level. The only thing certain in this economic turmoil is uncertainty. The sole chance for surviving as a capitalist under such circumstances consists in using all possibilities for increasing profit, regardless of the consequences. Within capitalism, crises cannot be avoided, even if one can more or less figure out the developments that will lead to crisis. In the general level of depiction intended by Marx in Capital, nothing further can be said concerning the concrete development of specific crises. The progression of specific crises is dependent upon the respective concrete circumstances, such as technical and operational developments, the structure of the credit system, the position of a country on the world market, a priority for capital, particularly in times of crisis, the organization of the working class and its struggles, and the manner of state intervention in the business cycle. This is not only true for the course of the usual economic cycle of roughly 10 years, but particularly for long-term supercyclical developments. At this point, we reach the limits of Marx's intended depiction of the capitalist mode of production at its ideal average. Section 2. Is there a theory of collapse in Marx's work? Because of their destructive sides, economic crises were often regarded in the classical workers' movement as an existential threat for capitalism. The possibility for economic crises leading to a crisis of the political system was conceived as follows. In light of the difficulties of economic reproduction, political power relations would lose their legitimacy and people would begin to rebel. In the early 1850s, Marx saw the revolutionary movements that shook Europe in 1848 and 1849 as consequences of the heavy economic crises of 1847 to 1848. Somewhat hastily, Marx generalized this result and expected the next revolution to come with the next crisis. The following economic crisis made it clear that there is no necessarily direct connection between crisis and revolutionary movement. Since the 20th century, at the very least, we have learned that the insecurity brought about by dramatic economic crisis can also provide a breeding ground for nationalist and fascist movements. In the history of the workers' movement, the notion that economic crises would ultimately lead to the collapse of capitalism, that capitalism was marching towards its final crisis, was widespread. Capital was interpreted as providing a Marxian theory of collapse. We can find this idea in the old German Social Democratic Party before 1914, in the work of Rosa Luxemburg, and in an elaborated form in the work of Heinrich Grossman. In Germany in the 1990s, this old idea was revived by Robert Kurz and the group Crisis. In the third volume of Capital, Marx speaks of the barriers of the capitalist mode of production, but not in the sense of a temporal end. A barrier should be understood here as a restriction. Capital develops the forces of production to an extent unknown in previous modes of production, but this development merely serves the small-minded aim of the valorization of capital. The true barrier of capitalist production, quote, the true barrier of capitalist production is capital itself. It is that capital and its self-expansion appear as the starting and finishing point, as the motive and the purpose of production. Production is only production for capital, and not the reverse, i.e. the means of production are not simply means for steadily expanding pattern of life for the society of the producers. End quote. Capital, Volume 3, page 358. Marx then speaks of a persistent conflict between the unrestricted development of the forces of production and the restricted capitalist aim, but there is no mention of a collapse of any sort. In only one single passage, not in Capital, but in the earlier Grundrisse, do we find a comment that could be interpreted as a theory of collapse. Marx notes that within the context of the increasing importance of the application of science to the productive process, it is no longer primarily the labor expended in the production process that is of significance, but rather the application of science, the general productive force. Marx thus draws the conclusion of a collapse of the whole of mode of production resulting from these changes within the capitalist process of production. Quote, as soon as labor in its immediate form has ceased to be the great source of wealth, labor time ceases and must cease to be its measure, and therefore exchange value must cease to be the measure of use value. The surplus value of the masses has ceased to be the condition for the development of general wealth, just as the non-labor of the few has ceased to be the condition for the development of general powers of the human mind. As a result, production based on exchange value collapses. End quote. In his later works, Marx does not return to this idea from the Grundrisse. On the contrary, Marx implicitly rejected his former arguments for a collapse. First, the significance of science for the capitalist production process is dealt with in many passages of the first volume of Capital, but the, quote, separation of the intellectual faculties of production processes from manual labor, end quote, Capital, Volume 1, page 548, is not regarded as weakening the capitalist mode of production, but as a force for increasing the power of capital over labor. Second, the value side of this process, the fact that increasingly less labor must be expended in the process of producing a single commodity, is not regarded in Capital as a tendency towards collapse, but as the foundation for the production of relative surplus value. The apparent contradiction that so astonished Marx in the Grundrisse, that Capital, quote, striving to reduce labor time to a minimum, while on the other hand, positing labor time as the sole measure and source of wealth, end quote, which is elevated by contemporary representatives of collapse theory, like Robert Kurz, to a, quote, logical self-contradiction of capital, end quote, necessarily leading to capitalism's collapse, is causally deciphered by Marx in the first volume of Capital as an old riddle of political economy with which the 18th century French economist Quesnay had harried his opponents. This riddle, according to Marx, is easy to grasp when one considers that the individual capitalist is not concerned with the absolute value of a commodity, but with the surplus value or profit that the commodity brings in. The labor time necessary for the production of a single commodity can decline. The value of the commodity decreases, as long as the surplus value or profit produced by the capitalist capital increases. Whether the surplus value or profit is apportioned among all small number of producers of high value or a large number of whether the surplus value profit is apportioned among a small number of products of high value or a large number of products with a smaller value is therefore insignificant. Even disregarding all the detailed objections, Theories of collapse are confronted with the fundamental problem that they claim an inevitable developmental tendency that capitalism is so unable to deal with that its further existence necessarily becomes impossible, regardless of whatever happens in the actual course of history. For the left, the theory of collapse of capitalism has historically always had an excusatory function. Regardless of how bad contemporary defeats were, the opponent's ends were a certainty. To criticize such theories of collapse means in no way to defend capitalism, as some representatives of collapse theory maintain. Such a critic just aims to fight against capitalism without illusions that rest on badly founded theories.